And it was discovered that the rhesus factor could be positive or negative. Most humans in the world are rhesus positive.
Most of the world didn't have it until colonization started in the 15th century.
For decades, scientists believed blood types were one of the simplest facts in human biology. 4 categories: A, B, AB, and O. A clean, tidy system taught in classrooms and printed on medical charts around the world. But hidden inside that simplicity was a quiet mystery, one that most people, even many scientists, never questioned. Because when researchers began looking closely at type O blood, something strange appeared. Patterns in its distribution, patterns in disease survival, patterns buried deep in ancient DNA, patterns that didn't make sense. In fact, the more scientists studied type O blood, the more it began to look less like a simple medical classification and more like the echo of a survival story written into human genetics. A story that may stretch back tens of thousands of years. Because while most people know type O as the universal donor, few realize how unusual it actually is. Unlike other blood types, type O carries none of the A or B antigens on the surface of its red blood cells. In biological terms, it's almost blank. This is why doctors rely on it during emergencies. Without those antigens, the immune system of a recipient is far less likely to reject the transfusion. It slips into the bloodstream quietly, doing its job without triggering an immune alarm. For decades, that was the entire explanation. Type O blood was useful. End of story. But when geneticists began mapping blood type frequencies around the world, they discovered something unexpected. In certain populations, type O wasn't just common, it was overwhelmingly dominant. In parts of South America, nearly 90 to 100% of indigenous populations carried type O blood. The same pattern appeared in isolated regions of Central America. Even in some Arctic communities thousands of miles away, type O appeared with unusual frequency. At first, researchers had a convenient explanation: isolation. When small populations remain separated from the rest of the world for long periods of time, their genetic traits can be amplified through a process known as genetic drift. If early settlers happened to carry type O blood, the theory went, their descendants might simply inherit that trait generation after generation. It sounded reasonable, but the deeper scientists looked, the less convincing the explanation became. Because this pattern wasn't limited to a handful of isolated villages, it stretched across entire continents. From the Amazon basin to the high Andes, from Central America to the northern tundra, the same dominance appeared again and again. And when researchers ran genetic simulations, they encountered a troubling result. Random drift should not produce this level of uniformity. Over thousands of years, at least some variation should remain. Type A should appear occasionally, type B should survive in small pockets. Yet in many regions, they were almost completely absent, as if something had filtered them out. For years, scientists avoided asking the obvious question, because the implication was unsettling. If type O blood had not simply spread by chance, then something else must have been shaping human genetics. Something powerful enough to erase entire blood types from vast populations. And when researchers finally turned to ancient DNA for answers, the mystery only deepened. Because the earliest human remains from Asia, the very ancestors believed to have migrated into the Americas, carried a wide range of blood types, A, B, and O, which meant that when the first humans crossed into the New World, they should have carried all 3 with them. But somewhere along the way, 2 of them almost disappeared. The question was simple: what happened to them? And the answer, scientists would soon discover, might point to a forgotten survival trial buried deep in human history. Because when the genetic timeline was reconstructed, the disappearance of those blood types did not happen slowly. It happened suddenly. And that sudden change raised a disturbing possibility. What if early human populations had faced a crisis, one that only a specific blood type could survive? At first, the idea sounded extreme, but the next discovery would make scientists reconsider everything they thought they knew about blood type evolution. Because hidden inside modern medical data was a pattern no one had noticed before, a pattern linking type O blood to survival itself. And once researchers began comparing global health data, they found something deeply unsettling. Because across multiple deadly diseases, type O blood seemed to behave differently. But that was only the beginning. The deeper scientists dug into global health data, the more a strange pattern began to emerge, one that hinted type O blood might carry something far more powerful than anyone expected. And that realization would lead researchers into an entirely new field of investigation, one that connected ancient epidemics, modern genetics, and a hidden biological advantage that might have shaped the course of human history. But the first clue didn't come from archaeology or ancient bones. It came from a modern discovery hiding in plain sight inside hospital records around the world. And what those records revealed would change the way scientists looked at type O blood forever. Because in case after case, patients with type O blood seemed to have slightly better odds of surviving certain infections. Not dramatically, but consistently. At first, it looked like coincidence. But when epidemiologists compiled the numbers across millions of cases, the pattern became impossible to ignore. And that's when the real investigation began. Because if type O blood truly offered even a small survival advantage over thousands of years, that advantage could reshape entire populations. It could determine who lived and who didn't. But proving that theory required something far more difficult. Scientists needed evidence from the distant past, evidence preserved not in medical charts, but in ancient DNA. And when that evidence finally emerged, it would reveal something no one expected. Because buried in frozen soil thousands of miles away, archaeologists would uncover a discovery that changed the entire story. A discovery that hinted the mystery of type O blood might begin far earlier than anyone imagined, hidden deep in the frozen ground of prehistoric Siberia. And what scientists found inside that ancient DNA would make the mystery even harder to explain. The first real breakthrough didn't come from a hospital or a laboratory. It came from the frozen ground of northern Siberia. For decades, archaeologists had been uncovering the remains of ancient human populations preserved in permafrost. These bodies, sometimes tens of thousands of years old, contained fragments of DNA still intact enough for modern genetic analysis. At first, researchers were focused on migration patterns. They wanted to understand how early humans moved across Asia and eventually into the Americas. But buried within those genetic samples was another piece of information: blood type markers. And when scientists began reconstructing them, they expected to see the same variety that exists today across most of the world: type A, type B, type O. Instead, something strange appeared. Among some of the oldest populations connected to the ancestors of Native Americans, type O blood began appearing with unusual frequency. Not exclusively, but more often than expected. At first, researchers assumed this was simply the early stage of genetic drift, the same explanation that had been used for decades. But then the timeline started to form. Roughly 25,000 to 15,000 years ago, human populations in northern Asia experienced an extreme bottleneck, a period when climate conditions during the last ice age forced groups of people into isolated refuges where survival was incredibly difficult. Food was scarce, temperatures dropped to lethal extremes, entire populations disappeared. And during those brutal centuries, something remarkable appears to have happened inside the human gene pool. Some traits survived, others faded away. When scientists compared DNA before and after this bottleneck, they noticed subtle but consistent changes in blood type frequencies. Type O began increasing, while type A and type B began declining. The shift was slow at first, almost invisible across individual generations, but over thousands of years, the trend became undeniable. which raised a disturbing possibility. What if type O blood carried a hidden advantage during times of extreme environmental stress? Because if even a small survival edge existed, natural selection would amplify it. Every harsh winter, every famine, every epidemic. Over generations, the survivors would gradually reshape the genetic landscape. And when those populations eventually migrated into the Americas across the ancient land bridge known as Beringia, they may have already carried a genetic signature shaped by survival. But this theory had a problem. Climate alone couldn't fully explain the disappearance of other blood types. Cold temperatures affect everyone equally. Hunger does not discriminate by blood group, so something else had to be involved. And the answer, some researchers suspected, might lie in one of the most powerful evolutionary forces in human history: disease. Because throughout the story of humanity, pathogens have acted like invisible filters, shaping populations in ways we are only beginning to understand. Smallpox reshaped entire continents. Malaria drove the evolution of sickle cell traits. The Black Death altered the genetic makeup of Europe. So what if something similar happened thousands of years earlier? A prehistoric epidemic powerful enough to quietly reshape blood type distribution across entire populations. The idea sounded speculative, but then scientists began comparing blood types to modern disease outcomes, and what they discovered raised even more questions. Because in certain infections, individuals with type O blood seem to experience different immune responses, sometimes stronger, sometimes weaker, but rarely identical to other blood types. One of the earliest clues came from research into severe malaria infections. In regions where malaria has historically been common, type O blood appears to provide partial protection against some of the disease's most dangerous complications. The parasite can still infect the body, but the way red blood cells interact with infected cells changes in subtle ways that may reduce the risk of fatal outcomes. This doesn't make type O immune, but even a small advantage matters in evolutionary terms. Across thousands of years of repeated exposure, a population carrying that advantage could gradually shift toward that blood type. But malaria alone could not explain the patterns seen in the Americas. Malaria did not historically exist in many of the regions where type O became dominant, which meant another factor must have been involved. And that's when scientists began examining something even more fundamental: the way pathogens interact with the antigens found on red blood cells. Remember those tiny molecular markers that define A and B blood types? They're not just labels for transfusions. They are also biological docking points. Some bacteria and viruses can attach to these structures when invading the body, which means different blood types may create slightly different environments for pathogens. In other words, certain diseases might spread more easily among specific blood groups. And if a deadly epidemic favored individuals without those molecular targets, type O blood might quietly become the ultimate survivor. This theory remained controversial for years, partly because evidence from ancient epidemics is extremely difficult to reconstruct. But in recent decades, advances in genetic sequencing have opened new doors. Scientists can now extract fragments of pathogen DNA from ancient skeletons, revealing traces of diseases that swept through prehistoric populations. And when researchers began applying this technology to human remains across Eurasia, they discovered signs of multiple ancient epidemics, some caused by bacteria, others by viruses, many of them predating written history by tens of thousands of years. Yet within those same ancient populations, another pattern kept appearing: a gradual shift in blood type markers, favoring type O. It wasn't proof, but it was enough to spark a new question among evolutionary biologists. What if type O blood isn't just a medical category, but the genetic footprint of humanity's past battles with disease? Because if ancient epidemics repeatedly favored individuals without A or B antigens, then the spread of type O blood might represent something far more dramatic than random evolution. It might represent the survivors of a forgotten biological war. And that possibility would lead scientists to investigate something even more surprising. Because hidden within the genetics of type O blood, they would soon uncover a mutation that changed everything. A mutation that may hold the key to understanding why this blood type behaves so differently from the others. And once researchers realized how that mutation works, the mystery of type O blood became even deeper. Because what looked like a simple absence of antigens might actually be the result of one of the most important genetic changes in human history. For most of modern medical history, scientists described type O blood in the simplest possible way. It was the blood type that lacked A and B antigens. Nothing more, nothing less. But as genetic sequencing technology improved, researchers began looking deeper into the DNA responsible for these blood types. And what they found was surprising. Type O blood wasn't actually a separate genetic system. It was the result of a mutation. To understand why this matters, scientists had to examine the gene responsible for the entire ABO blood group system. Inside human DNA, a specific gene produces enzymes that attach molecular markers to the surface of red blood cells. If the enzyme attaches one kind of marker, the blood becomes type A. If it attaches a different marker, the blood becomes type B. If both enzymes are present, the blood becomes type AB. But in individuals with type O blood, something unusual happens. The gene responsible for producing those enzymes contains a tiny change, a mutation that disrupts the process entirely. Instead of creating A or B markers, the enzyme simply doesn't function, which means the red blood cells remain untouched, blank. This discovery changed how scientists viewed type O blood, because it meant type O wasn't the original blood type many people assumed. It was actually the result of a genetic alteration, a small deletion in the genetic code, just a single missing piece in the genetic code, yet that tiny change erased the entire antigen system on red blood cells. And once scientists realized this, a new question emerged. When did that mutation happen? To answer it, researchers began comparing human DNA with that of other primates, chimpanzees, gorillas, even more distant primate relatives. And what they discovered was fascinating. The ABO blood group system is incredibly ancient. Versions of A and B blood types exist in multiple primate species, suggesting that this genetic system evolved millions of years ago, long before modern humans appeared. But type O blood, as it exists in humans today, appears to be much younger. The mutation responsible for it likely occurred within the human lineage itself. In other words, at some point in our evolutionary history, a small genetic error created a new blood type. At first, it would have been incredibly rare, one individual, then perhaps their children. But for that mutation to spread across large populations, something must have favored it. Natural selection rarely allows a genetic change to dominate unless it provides some kind of advantage. Which brought scientists back to the same theory again and again: survival. If type O blood offered even a slight benefit against certain environmental pressures, disease, infection, or other threats, individuals carrying that mutation might have been more likely to survive and pass it on. Over thousands of years, that advantage could reshape entire populations. But the story became even more intriguing when researchers began studying how blood type affects the immune system. Because the absence of A and B antigens changes how the body recognizes foreign invaders. The immune system constantly scans the bloodstream for unfamiliar molecules. When it encounters something it doesn't recognize, it launches an attack. For people with type A or type B blood, their immune systems are accustomed to seeing those antigens as part of the body. But individuals with type O blood lack both markers, which means their immune systems may react differently to pathogens that mimic A or B structures. Some scientists believe this difference could influence how certain infections spread or how aggressively the body responds. Again, it doesn't create perfect immunity, but it could slightly shift the odds. And in evolutionary terms, even small shifts matter. If one group survives infections at a slightly higher rate, generation after generation, that difference compounds. Over centuries, over millennia, gradually the survivors shape the genetic future of their populations. But there was still another puzzle. If type O blood carried such a potential advantage, why didn't it become dominant everywhere? Why do large parts of the world still contain significant numbers of type A and type B individuals? The answer may lie in the fact that no genetic trait is universally perfect. A trait that protects against one disease might increase vulnerability to another. For example, some studies suggest individuals with type O blood may experience higher risks in certain bleeding disorders because their blood tends to clot slightly less efficiently. Other research has explored potential links between blood types and different immune responses to viruses. These trade-offs are common in evolution. Nature rarely produces a single perfect design. Instead, it produces balance, different traits surviving in different environments depending on the challenges populations face. Which means the distribution of blood types across the world might reflect thousands of years of regional survival pressures, different diseases, different climates, different genetic advantages. But the deeper scientists explored these patterns, the more they realized something else. Type O blood didn't just appear in isolated pockets, it appeared again and again across populations that had faced extreme historical pressures. And when researchers mapped those patterns across continents, they began to notice something extraordinary. Because the regions with the highest concentration of type O blood shared a surprising connection. A connection stretching from the Americas to parts of Asia, and possibly even further back in time than anyone expected. A connection that suggested the spread of type O blood might be linked to one of the most dramatic migrations in human history. The movement of ancient populations across frozen landscapes at the edge of the Ice Age. But the more scientists studied that migration, the more one question kept resurfacing. What if the people who crossed those frozen lands were not just explorers? What if they were survivors? Survivors of environmental disasters, of ancient epidemics, or of genetic pressures that filtered humanity in ways we are only beginning to understand. Because if that were true, then type O blood might not just be another variation of human biology, it might be the genetic echo of the people who endured some of the most difficult chapters in our species' history. And the final clues supporting that theory were hidden in one last place scientists hadn't fully explored, the global genetic map of humanity itself. And what that map revealed would tie the entire mystery together. By the time scientists reached this point in their research, one idea was becoming harder to ignore. Type O blood might not simply be a variation, it might be the genetic signature of survival. Because when researchers mapped the global distribution of blood types alongside ancient migration routes, the patterns began to overlap in ways that were difficult to dismiss as coincidence. Across large parts of Europe and Asia, blood types A and B remained widely distributed. But in populations tied to some of the most extreme survival environments in human history, type O began appearing with unusual dominance. The Americas, certain Arctic regions, isolated highland communities, places where early humans faced enormous environmental pressure, long winters, limited food, and constant exposure to unfamiliar diseases as populations moved into new ecosystems. In those environments, survival often came down to tiny biological advantages, a slightly stronger immune response, a small resistance to infection, or a genetic mutation that quietly tipped the balance between life and death. When scientists began studying the immune behavior of type O blood more closely, they found clues that supported this possibility. The absence of A and B antigens doesn't just affect transfusions, it changes how the immune system interacts with certain pathogens. Some viruses and bacteria rely on molecular structures similar to those antigens when attaching to human cells. Without those structures present, the infection process can behave differently, sometimes slower, sometimes less severe. And while these differences are subtle on an individual level, they become powerful when multiplied across entire populations and thousands of years. In evolutionary terms, even a 1% survival advantage can reshape the future of a species. Generation after generation, survivors pass their genes forward. Until eventually, the population begins to reflect the traits that helped them endure. But perhaps the most compelling evidence of this survival pattern comes from one of the most dramatic migrations in human history. Roughly 20,000 years ago, during the final phase of the last ice age, small groups of humans began moving across a vast frozen landscape connecting Asia to North America. This land bridge, known as Beringia, stretched hundreds of miles between the continents. It was a brutal environment. Temperatures plunged far below freezing, vegetation was scarce, and entire communities lived on the edge of starvation. Yet somehow these early migrants survived long enough to cross into a completely new world. Over generations, their descendants spread across 2 continents, from the Arctic tundra to the forests of North America, to the mountains and jungles of South America. But when modern geneticists studied the descendants of those populations, they noticed something extraordinary. Across much of the Americas, type O blood dominates at levels rarely seen anywhere else on Earth. In many indigenous groups, more than 90% of individuals carry it. Some communities approach 100%. This level of genetic uniformity is extremely rare in human populations, and it suggests something powerful happened during or before that migration, something that filtered the gene pool dramatically. One theory proposes that small founding populations parried mostly type O blood from the beginning, but another, more controversial theory suggests that survival pressures during the Ice Age migration may have amplified that trait. If environmental conditions or disease outbreaks disproportionately affected individuals with other blood types, the survivors would gradually reshape the genetic profile of their descendants. Over thousands of years, the pattern would become more and more pronounced, until eventually the majority of the population carried the same trait. But the mystery doesn't end in the ancient past. Even today, scientists continue to explore how blood types influence human health. Some studies suggest individuals with type O blood may have lower risks of certain cardiovascular diseases. Others have examined how different blood groups respond to viral infections. During global health crises, researchers often investigate whether blood type influences susceptibility or severity. The results are complex and sometimes contradictory. But one thing is clear: blood type is far more than a label on a medical chart. It is part of a genetic system that has been evolving for millions of years, a system shaped by countless invisible battles between humans and the microscopic organisms that surround us. And within that system, type O blood remains one of the most fascinating clues scientists have uncovered, because it represents something unusual in human biology. A genetic change that removed 2 major molecular structures from red blood cells. A mutation that might once have seemed insignificant, yet over thousands of years it spread across populations, continents, and generations. Which raises a final, unsettling possibility. What if the reason type O blood became so widespread isn't because it was ordinary, but because it helped people survive moments in history when survival was far from guaranteed? Moments when disease swept through early communities, when climates shifted suddenly, when entire populations were pushed to the edge of extinction. In those moments, even the smallest biological advantage could mean the difference between disappearance and survival. And if that's true, then type O blood may represent more than a medical classification. It may represent a living record of humanity's past struggles. A quiet reminder that the bodies we carry today are shaped by countless generations who endured conditions we can barely imagine. Because every gene in our DNA tells a story, and sometimes those stories reveal something extraordinary. The possibility that hidden within our biology are traces of the ancient battles that shaped the human species. Battles against climate, against disease, against extinction itself. Which leads to one final question scientists are still trying to answer. If type O blood helped humans survive the past, what role might it play in the future? Because the deeper researchers explore human genetics, the more they realize something remarkable. The secrets of our survival may already be written inside us, waiting to be understood. If discoveries like this fascinate you, make sure to subscribe and explore the next video, because some of the most surprising secrets about human biology are only now beginning to emerge, and the next discovery might change the way we understand ourselves entirely.